Hello and welcome to our professional development today with the question of what critical barriers prevent students from participating in meaningful learning that encourages inclusive education. Inclusive education can be understood as an act of social justice which forces equity and equality for those within our primary school setting. In order to address how we deal with students, we must consider our why. Why does it matter? What does inclusion mean for us individually and as a collective? But more importantly, how do we enact this for our students? Inclusive education is underpinned by the core principle that students are not simply present at school, but that they are all provided opportunities to engage in meaningful learning. In this sense, we need to understand that as educators, we are accountable for enacting inclusive education, as our relations with students are a direct response to their own beliefs and values based on the learner. As we understand inclusive education and what it underpins, I'd like for us to consider Freer, 1996, who describes humans to be the agent of change. In this sense, we as teachers can be understood as agents of change, whose daily interactions with students either hinder or facilitate meaningful learning. In other words, human action is a process of reflection and action. It is through a reflective mindset that we are able to closely examine the context in which physical, emotional, and external factors influence the inclusiveness of the child. Nielsen, 2005, attests to the importance of attitude. In the context of the teacher, he reminds us that there is a direct correlation between an individual's attitude as being one of the biggest barriers to inclusion. He argues that the way in which an individual feels about inclusion directly affects the way it is enacted. By examining our own subconscious attitudes which contribute to the indirect or direct exclusion of students, we are able to refine our practices to ensure inclusion is more than just the buzzword itself. Values held by teachers hold important weight for the lives of our students, as it allows us to inquire for a deeper contextual knowledge into the underlying assumptions surrounding inclusive education. Our aim is to challenge our own assumptions today in an open and reflective way. Again, we are embodied with the task of being an agent of change. Let us now examine the historical context of inclusive education. In order to understand the trend of inclusive education, the past 3 decades must be analysed. It has been widely accepted that a common practice by teachers of predicting student potential has been solely based on the level of achievement attained by the learner. This theory of categorizing learners has perpetuated the need to design a range of different educational experiences. Ball, 1981, argues that these experiences have damaging effects on students as they highlight and reproduce social inequalities. And whilst categorizing previously has been understood as differentiation, such terms limit students' ability as teachers inadvertently hold ideologies on what the learner can and cannot do. In particular, it is through the medical model of disability perspective that knowledge is formed on the learner. Mandated policies within Australia. Relevant policies remain unclear, as it is argued the contradictory messages about inclusion are fundamentally what prevents inclusive education from promoting social justice. Although the Salamanca Statement by UNESCO 1994 has highlighted the need for a global understanding on the provision of enacting inclusive education, Article 24 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities stresses that parties whom have agreed to the Salamanca Statement adhere to providing an inclusive education system at all levels. Smith, 2002, says that despite this policy enactment in Australian schools, the development of inclusive practice differs greatly across schools, as the term inclusion and how it should essentially be enacted is inconsistent and often changes over time. We often see this with similar schools in our area. While education is primarily concerned with the setting, purpose, and political ideology of students, it is notably designed for an undifferentiated student. The reality is that schools, whether intentionally or not, are not always catering to the students with needs. International policy has largely been influenced by UNESCO since 1948, where the critical development of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was established. On the contrary, with each country adapting to the policy, the last half century has seen an increase in a universal commitment to adhering and enacting an education concerned with child's rights. Despite policies either enabling or constraining inclusive education, it is notably important to consider the role of the teacher and their understanding of policy. Honen's 2004 analysis of policy texts identifies how both the teacher is positioned within policy and that teachers' readings of the text matter. He suggests that others are encouraged to engage with educational researchers in an attempt at committing to an apparatus of social critique. The medical model as a deficit. Why do we turn to this so often in education? The medical model of disability is the most common understanding of disability, where assumptions are made on an individual. Consequently, these assumptions form the bias for which policies are made. Research on grounded theory compares how a medical model or deficit model of disability, along with differing terminology, acts as a barrier to inclusion. It discusses how models of disability are fundamentally connected with different attitudes, values, systems, and beliefs which conceptualize special education. Inclusive pedagogy. I'd like for you to turn your attention to this picture as I describe what an inclusive pedagogy means. This is an approach that is based on the belief that teachers must first recognize that decisions and actions surrounding the organization of learning extend far beyond the learning of a lesson. The word pedagogy can be understood as the way in which knowledge and skills held by the teacher inform practices. Above all, these practices either enable or constrain inclusive education from becoming a reality. But how often do we stop to think about our own pedagogy and how this benefits or hinders the students in our care? Do we really understand the difference between equity and equality? Discourse as a barrier to inclusion. One of the most vital responsibilities of advocating inclusion is our ability to consistently re-examine assumptions which inform our perspectives. In particular, this means questioning the discourse surrounding inclusion that we engage in. Research suggests that teachers are increasingly talking about inclusion as an impossibility within their current environment. Time constraints, pressure to perform, and lack of support are all factors which influence the idea of inclusion being impossible, and is experienced by all teachers at different stages in their career. Perhaps with the increasing pressure of teachers being more accountable for the learning of our students, the ability to teach an individual effectively is not wanted but needed. As cited in Allen, a teacher in Harvey Kolpin's 2006 research conveyed that an immense amount of guilt, stating, "It takes more human hands than are available." This is a predicament we too often find ourselves in. Guilt is a more complex and perhaps hidden emotion, as this requires us to admit our limitations within the classroom. Perhaps by opening up discourses will exempt us teachers from feeling guilty, and is a step towards understanding inclusive education. Discourses surrounding inclusive education vary depending on whom we are speaking with. And whilst it is recommended to use the people-first language when addressing students with a disability, too often this is not always the case. Misleading and often vague discourses are casually used in the workforce, which can cause a barrier towards how we holistically view the child. Negotiating inclusive spaces. Inclusion is a way of life, and it's a way of thinking into action. This involves us to consciously commit to creating authentic democratic communities where diversity is honoured and valued. Being a part of an inclusive community means being aware of exclusionary practices and creating new interpersonal connections. So how do we identify barriers within our context? We're going to look at the Index for Inclusion by Booth and Ainscough, and some of the guiding questions we have here are to support thinking about how we practice inclusion within our school context. We're going to review the framework, so dimensions and sections, by structuring the approach to the evaluation and development of the school. What are the gaps for us? What can we identify and what do we need to improve? We're also going to review some materials, indicators and questions, which will enable a more detailed review of all aspects of the school, and we'll actually take on hearing our staff but also our students. And then following from those questionnaires, there will be a process that we review. So we're going to plan for change and put plans into practice that are in fact inclusive. It is essential, therefore, that we understand inclusive education to be a movement, which relies on the governments, principals, teachers, and the community to aspire to sharing the same vision. As a staff, we need to get onto the same page as to what we believe inclusion to be. To assist us as frontline workers within primary education, the Index for Inclusion framework by Booth and Ainscough encourages our school community to explore the values and beliefs by examining challenging assumptions held by us. Similarly, Frere's theory of humans as agents of change, the Index for Inclusion affirms and extends Frere's idea. We are solely able to make change within our setting. Booth and Ainscough state that inclusive education is about increasing participation for all children and adults. It is about supporting schools to become more responsive to the diversity of children's backgrounds, interests, experience, knowledge, and skills. Understandably, organisations and institutions such as schools are encouraged to value the diverse backgrounds, interests, and experience of students. And this can be achieved by celebrating the profound knowledge and vast capacities of all participants in the ways that are inclusive. Reflective practitioners, what does that mean for our context? By adapting theoretical and ethical principles underpinning the Index for Inclusion, provides us with a model of learning and teaching that responds to diversity in our context, without stigmatising and stereotyping students with disability. Onboarding our beginning teachers. Given that we have new teachers beginning next year, it is important that we focus on understanding ethics as an alternative to approaching different situations. This requires different approaches depending on our students' needs. When teachers inquire about practices through critical reflection, they are able to move beyond unexamined judgments, interpretations, assumptions, and expectations. We can begin this process by following 3 practices that are quintessential to being reflective practitioners, by making time for reflection and becoming a perpetual problem solver, and questioning the status quo. By challenging the status quo, we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, but also display a willingness to critically think about the way in which education is understood, perceived, and then taught. Booth and Ainscogh's work can be divided up into 3 main parts: Dimension A, B, and C. It is these guiding questions that allow us all to critically think about how we perceive our school community. We will use the following questionnaire on the screen with all our staff to identify any barriers, misconceptions, or assumptions that we have. Dimension A is about creating inclusive cultures. We need to ask the overarching questions: is there a recognition of the existence of institutional discrimination and the need to minimise all forms of it? Do we believe that there are some practices in our school where we are in fact not being inclusive? And do staff and students understand the origins of discrimination and intolerance to difference? Do they have a background on what discrimination is? And is attention paid to the exclusionary pressures on ethnic minority students and the way intolerance to difference may be interpreted as racism? Do we have a voice and agency for our students who are a part of the minority? Dimension B, producing inclusive policies. We can ask ourselves, does the school have an induction program for students and staff? Are steps taken to find out the extent to which new students and new staff feel welcomed in the new school after a few weeks? Do staff consider the opportunities created for students to teach and learn from each other in diverse groups? And are all support policies coordinated in a strategy for increasing the capacity of the school to respond to diversity? Dimension C is about evolving inclusive practices. Do class and subject teachers take responsibility for the learning of all students in their lessons? Do lessons build on differences in students' knowledge and experience? Can students record their work in a variety of ways, using drawings, photographs, and written work? In addition to this, we will also collect responses from our students. After collating the data, we will be able to target goals and values surrounding our gaps. For instance, if most students agree or disagree to a certain statement, it will tell us which parts we need to make more inclusive. I want to leave you with a pedagogy of hope notion. This is about applying critical imagination to perceive and address social and institutional barriers within our context. Together, through critical reflection, we can aim towards a more inclusive community. So thank you again for participating in this professional development, and we will hand out the staff surveys and the student surveys, and we will get back together to work on our next best steps. Thank you.